We have some concerning new reports coming out of the US economy right now that suggest that things are not so good and that they could get worse in 2025. And the first of these reports that I want to bring up to you guys is the big collapse in consumer spending that occurred in January. Data from the Census Bureau came out and said that we had an almost 1% decline in spending month over month in seasonally adjusted terms. That was the worst decline in spending in a year and a half. At the same time, we're now having a slew of corporate layoffs. Southwest, one of the biggest airlines in America, is now going to lay off 15% of their corporate workforce in their first ever corporate layoff in its 50-year history. At the same time, Chevron, the second largest oil producer in the US, just announced that they're going to lay off 20% of their entire global workforce. And not to be outdone, Mark Zuckerberg just announced that Meta is going to be laying off 5% of its global workforce. What these news stories signal is that the US economy is on unstable footing in 2025. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of potential volatility, because the one segment of the US economy that really seems to be getting hit hard by these layoffs is white-collar workers. White-collar workers are predominantly the ones who are getting the pink slips from the big corporations and who are getting the pink slips from the US government right now. This is especially true in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is bearing the brunt of the layoffs in America as we speak. The unemployment applications there are skyrocketing, and it's these white-collar workers who are typically home buyers in a neighborhood like this. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia currently, north of the city, in a wealthier suburb called Brookhaven. The median household income here in Brookhaven, according to data on Reventure app, is $138,000. This is one of the wealthiest areas in Atlanta, and many of the people who came down to Atlanta over the last 3 or 4 years and bought homes were remote workers. And they moved in and bought up the homes with cheap mortgage rates. And so you have to ask, what's going to happen to these local housing markets? I think we could see home values drop by a lot in certain neighborhoods and cities. And in fact, these home values are already dropping. If you go here in Atlanta, where I am right now, basically, the entire south side of the metro is in a housing recession. Downtown, Midtown's in a housing recession. Prices are dropping in many different zip codes across Atlanta right now. But now I want to get back to some of those original news stories, because I think it's kind of interesting how I'm not seeing the media talk about this too much. You know, these corporate layoffs. It really struck me that Chevron in particular is laying off 20% of their workforce, because Chevron is a big oil producer. And Trump getting elected was supposed to cause the oil producers to get more bullish and to drill more oil. But instead, a month after Trump is elected, Chevron cuts 20% of its workforce and scales back their oil production plans in the Permian Basin. Chevron came out and said, we're cutting our investment into the Permian Basin in Texas, so we're going to drill less oil. That's pretty strange, everyone. And it suggests that, the thought that Trump was going to just fix everything and everything was going to just get better immediately was always misguided. Because if I'm going to be honest, Trump inherited a pretty tough situation in the economy when he took over, right? I mean, the cost of buying a house, the cost of renting, the cost of buying eggs in the grocery store, it's all skyrocketed over the last 3 or 4 years. When he came into office in 2016, it was a much better economic situation back then. Things were much cheaper. There was a lot more room for growth. There isn't much room for growth right now. I mean, the federal government debt is 120% of GDP. Now, Trump is partly responsible for that debt going up so high because he was in charge in 2018, 2019 when they cut taxes by a lot and increased the deficit. He was also in charge in 2020 with that first boom in pandemic government spending. Then Biden took over, and Biden initially said, we're going to make the deficit less, then he made the deficit way more, and the spending went up even more. And so really the last 8 years, the federal government in America has been very, let's just call it, frivolous in how they spend money. And now we're paying the price for it. Now the interest rates are higher. The mortgage rates are over 7%. The 10-year treasury yield is 4.5%. The borrowing costs for America are surging, and when the Fed cuts interest rates, that doesn't even lower borrowing costs anymore. When the Fed cut short-term rates the last 4 or 5 months, the long-term rates just kept going up because the US government has so much debt and is issuing so many bonds, and there aren't enough buyers that the interest rates are just going to keep going up regardless. And so ultimately, what we need to do as a country is lower our spending, lower our debt, and that's what Trump and Elon Musk are trying to do right now with Doge. They're going into all the government agencies and they're basically taking a hatchet and they're cutting. You know, in the case of certain agencies, they're trying to shut them down or lay off the staff by 50%. It's very severe what they're doing, and their hopes are that we're going to lower the government spending enough and reduce the deficit that's going to bring down the long-term interest rates. And I think in the long term, that should potentially work. However, in the short term, there's a problem. And that's the fact that very fast, Trump is just basically tearing down the system that was put in place during the pandemic, tearing down the system that was put in place in the last 30 years with globalization and the US running off growth in debt. So if you're trying to tear all that down in a matter of weeks or months, it's going to create instability and uncertainty in the economy, which is going to cause people to cut back their spending, which is why I believe we saw the big drop in spending in January. January 2025 saw a 0.9% decline month over month in spending. Now, some people say, hey, spending always drops in January because it's after Christmas, and that's true. However, this data from the census is seasonally adjusted, so it adjusts for that seasonal decrease, and even with that adjustment, the spending went down 0.9%, suggesting that consumers don't feel so great about the economy right now, which is underscored by that data from the University of Michigan, which showed that consumer sentiment in February tanked and is down from where it was last February in 2024 by 12%. So you have declining retail sales, plummeting sentiment. That's not good for the economy. And as a result, no one is buying homes right now. This is the other fact and the other data point that really is kind of checkmate on the economy right now and is a signal that things are not so good. It's the fact that home buyer demand continues to drop from already historically low levels. The mortgage application index in America today, mid-February, it's at one of its lowest points for the history of the index going back 30 years in February. We're down almost 60% from the pandemic peak in mortgage applications to buy a house, and we're down about 40% from pre-pandemic levels of mortgage applications. So think about that. We have 40% fewer people applying for a mortgage to buy a house than we did in 2018, 2019. At the same time, cash buyers are also exiting the housing market. Redfin just came out with a new report talking about how cash sales dropped to their lowest level in 10 years. Cash transactions are down 35% from their pre-pandemic highs in nominal terms. In percentage terms, it was the lowest share of cash transactions in 3 years. Around 32% of homes were bought all cash. And of course, there's big differences around America in how many people buy with cash. Down in Florida, it has one of the highest cash transaction percentages. West Palm Beach is at 50%. If you go to California in San Jose, only 20% of people buy in cash. And that data on Florida is really interesting because there's still this prevailing wisdom among many people that like the cash buyers are there buying homes and supporting the market. And in West Palm Beach, 49% of all purchases are done in cash. And so you would think naturally like, oh, that would mean the West Palm Beach housing market's more insulated from a downturn. But when you actually look at the data, home sales in West Palm Beach, whether it's cash or mortgage, are down about 50% from where they were 3 years ago. There's the lowest level of buyer demand in West Palm Beach that we've seen in a decade. But things are getting pretty bad and pretty dire in the Florida housing market right now. But one area that's actually holding up is the neighborhood I am in right now. I am in Brookhaven, north of Atlanta. And this is one of the wealthiest areas in Atlanta. The median income is $138,000, like I said before. And a house like this, maybe it's a 4-bed, 3-bath. These houses typically go for like 800 grand in this neighborhood. You can see this is kind of like your quintessential American suburb. I feel like when I think of a US suburb, I think of houses like this. A lot of them are brick. A lot of them look like they were built maybe in the 40s or 50s. Very attractive area. The schools are decent. And if we look at data on Reventure app, you can see that actually in this zip code, home values are still up about 2% year over year. The Reventure app price forecast score is a 53 out of 100, indicating we think the prices here will be stable over the next year due to the fact that inventory is still low. And the reason that these neighborhoods in Atlanta, north of the city, are doing better is because they're wealthier. And one trend we are seeing is that the wealthier the neighborhood is from a housing market standpoint right now, the more that the buyer demand is holding up and the less that people are forced to sell. And that last point's key. People who are wealthier and have a higher income and more savings, even if the market's in a downturn, they aren't going to feel forced to sell and take a loss on their home, which is why home values tend to be more stable in wealthier areas. If we actually go back to the last crash in 2008 and look at this zip code map of Atlanta, you could see the areas where I am right now only went down 15%, 20%, while the areas south of Atlanta went down 70%. So there's huge regional variation in the last crash here in Atlanta. And there will also be a huge regional variation to this downturn. We're already seeing it play out. Prices are still going up here in Brookhaven. Prices are going up in Buckhead and Sandy Springs, but they're dropping basically everywhere downtown to the south of Atlanta. The prices are dropping. They're still going up in the wealthier neighborhoods. This situation is also playing out in Dallas. Dallas is another market similar to Atlanta where we're seeing the wealthier areas do better, but the more low-income, investor-driven areas struggle. And so this is something to think about if you are a prospective home buyer, is these regional differences that are occurring in your market. But like I said earlier, I wonder if these wealthier neighborhoods are going to start to run into issues with all of these layoffs. Like one area I'm thinking in particular is Fairfax and Loudoun County outside of DC. Fairfax and Loudoun County outside of DC, those are two of the most high income areas in America. In Loudoun County, the median income is like $180,000. Now, those areas are bedroom communities to DC, and their prices went way up during the pandemic, and inventory there is still very low. But one has to wonder, with these huge government layoffs of a lot of bureaucratic jobs where people make six figures, are we going to see a big reduction in home buyer demand in Fairfax and Loudoun County? Are we going to see a lot of people forced to sell their homes? We haven't seen that in the data yet in DC. Most of the surge in inventory has happened in the District of Columbia, not so much in the suburbs. But the other thing I'm paying attention to, everyone, is remote work, or I should say the elimination of remote work. The other thing that Trump did as part of his policies when he took office is he mandated government employees come into the office 5 days a week. And that's a mandate that other companies and corporations are now following. And we're now seeing a lot of Americans who moved to the South during the pandemic being forced to move back to where they came from in DC, New York, and California. So if you're not requiring those workers to come in, that's going to have a big shift in terms of like housing demand. I'm thinking again of people who moved down to Atlanta or moved to Tampa or moved to Austin who might have been government workers working remote. Well, now they're going to have to go back to DC or face losing their job. Additionally, I know some people personally who are facing these mandates. I know someone who works for Amazon who lives in Florida. They are getting the call back to Seattle. Meanwhile, I've talked to other people who work for tech companies who are saying that the new return to office mandates are actually more stringent than what was in place prior to the pandemic. And some tech companies aren't even allowing you to leave the state if you do have days off where you can work remote. They want you to be in the state on those days, and they track that somehow. And so where I guess I'm getting with a lot of this, everyone, is that there's so much uncertainty and volatility in the economy right now. And you need to be aware of that, because things are shifting fast, and you want to see if your market is starting to trend down or is continuing to go up, particularly if you're here in Atlanta, if you're in DC, if you're in Florida, or if you're in Tennessee and Texas, where I'm going to go next.